Hey everyone, Yoyston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we're looking at some of the best weapons in Middle-earth that have almost no lore behind either how they came to the characters that made them famous, such as Sting to Bilbo, Narsil to Elendil, or what happened to them after their respective stories, like Anguiril and others. Now, to be clear, these are theories or headcanons based on the lore, so not entirely canon of course, but certainly based on it and what we approximately know of such things, as we will likely never have an answer to their final fates or origins. Sources that helped with today's video will be in the description and cards, my friends. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. So concerning Sting, we know that it comes from Gondolin, of course, and that it ended up in that troll cave during The Hobbit, but when compared to Orcrist or Glamdring, we know so little about it. Granted, I think it was a good thematic choice, as it, like Bilbo, had powerful potential, but needed to carve its own story, not one of ancient history. However, since these weapons were quite rare, I must imagine that Sting was made for a purpose and a special person. If we may assume that Glamdring belonged to Torgon and Orcrist belonged to Ecthelion, or even Glorfindel or some other mighty elf of Gondolin, an elf of that stature, I must assume that Sting was honestly probably made for a young Eärendil. Now, I'm certainly not the first one to have thought of this idea, but I've loved it ever since I heard it, to make the young prince of Idril and Tuor look his part. Torgon perhaps had his forge masters create this for the young lordling, knowing that he would probably grow out of it at some point. There are other possibilities for Sting, of course, that perhaps it was meant to be an arming sword or dagger for some great elf, or made as a defensive weapon for even Idril, but it being a more ceremonial weapon for Eärendil, probably unused and left behind during the fall. I love this idea. If that is the case, I do believe that the swords found in the Troll Cave were probably all lost and left behind after the fall of Gondolin, since we know for certain that Torgon fell, and it is highly unlikely that his sword made it out based on how he died, his tower falling on his head. It was probably buried beneath rubble, but in that part of the city. In the same vein, it's very likely that Orcrist was probably in the same part of the city as well as Sting, and thus they made it out together. From there, it could be that the orcs brought the weapons out as trophies, likely wrapped as to not burn themselves, and were at some point assaulted by others later on. These people, or bandits, or some sort may have found themselves way further east after the fall of Gondolin, only to be slain by trolls, their trinkets taken to a cave, and there we go. Could be that elves grabbed the weapons and made it out from there, and eventually they were also taken by some bandits on the road and so forth, but I find it more likely that these weapons remained behind and were taken as trophies and so forth. Now, what happened to Sting after The Lord of the Rings? I know Frodo left it to Sam when he left Middle-earth, and Sam either left it to his descendants, gave it to Pippin or Merry, or bore it into the West. Perhaps he might have even left it in the Matham house or something like that as a relic of ancient days, though I doubt that, as the hobbits probably would not know the value of it and wouldn't take it as seriously as someone else. Since I am theorizing here, I actually think that Sam probably bore it into the West back with him when he eventually got to reunite with Frodo, and perhaps it returned to Glamdring in the last of the Elves of Gondolin. Perhaps even Eärendil saw it again if it was his. It, like so much else that is elfin, would likely diminish in the West. As a bit of a side note to Sting, we do know that Orcrist was to be with Thorin forever, but Glamdring, I think, went with Gandalf into the West too. Of course, there was no need for weapons in Valinor, and may even be seen as disgraceful to some degree, but it was a ceremonial piece of history, ancient and more current, the Blade of Torgon and then Gandalf. To me, it seems too powerful and incredible of an artifact to leave in the hands of men or amongst the ruins and remains of elven cities. It is an interesting combo here, but Narsil, forged by the dwarf Telkar, and Thingol's sword, Aranruth, are connected because, as it appears, they both end up in Doriath, most likely, passing onto the Númenóreans. I say this because, well, Aranruth became the sword of the kings of Númenor, and Narsil, a sword forged by Telkar, who made many things for the elves of Doriath, ended up also in the hands of Númenorian leaders, the lords of Andúnië, or at least the son of the last lord, Elendil. Now, for as epic and strong a blade as Narsil was, Aranruth must have been greater in some ways, in fact, than Anglakil, which became Gurthang, because even when Thingol was willing to part with that blade, Anglakil, he said he would not give up his own, at least to Beleg, when Beleg was searching for Túrin. We also know that Aranruth became the sword of the kings of Numenor, and again Narsil passed from the royal family into the line of Silmarillion, or was at least kept in the armories of Numenor until it eventually came to Elendil. I like to think that it was also a blade of the royal line, yet not quite as great as Aranruth, so eventually it passed into this separate offshoot of the royal family. As for the fates of these swords, Aranruth met its end in the destruction of Ar-Pharazôn's army in East Numenor, assuming he bore that blade of his forefathers. Narsil, of course, became Andoril, the blade of the heirs of Aragorn, King Elisar, carried on by his son Eldarion and his sons. Aeglos is an interesting case of having incredibly little information to go off of altogether. This spear might have come from the forges of some kingdom in Beleriand, or perhaps the forges of Lindon or Aurelian even. After bearing this through his life and falling to the fiery hand of Sauron, what became of Aeglos is a complete mystery. In The Lord of the Rings Online, it actually stayed in Mordor as a beacon of light and darkness. While I do like the quest around it, I highly doubt this would actually be the case. In fact, it may be seen as disrespectful to the Eldar and the memory of the last High King to leave it in such a place as Mordor. I like the idea that Aeglos remained in Rivendell near the shards of Narsil in the last homely house in Rivendell and was born across the sea when the elves of Rivendell diminished. Perhaps Elrond saw it as some last relic of his mentor and friend Gil-galad. Ringil, the blade that glittered like ice, a sword that actually wounded the Dark Lord 7 times and gave him permanent scars, is left to an unknown fate. Likely this sword was forged in Valinor after Melkor spread amongst the Noldor a panic that spurred the desire to create such weapons. That is also probably why it wounded Melkor so, because of the sheer power of both elf and sword, created in the uttermost west. When Fingolfin fell, it could be that the Eagles also lifted the blade with the fallen warrior and it was buried with him. And to be honest, even though it seems weird, I find it to be the most likely scenario, though it could be that it remained in the mire of the Elven King's blood, or in the Prince of Grond upon the earth, or even Melkor might have taken it as a trophy of his fallen foe. Anguiril, the sword of Eol, the Dark Elf, and the mate of Anglakil, which became Gurthing. We, of course, know what became of Gurthing and its whole story wrapped up with Turin's, but what of its equal and mate? Well, Maeglin, the son of Eol and Erithel, stole the sword from his father when he and his mother left for Gondolin. I must imagine that he held on to it, but perhaps lost it to Morgoth when he was captured. That, or he bore it during the fall of Gondolin, even as he tried to slay young Eärendil and was thrown from the city walls by Tuor. But if that were true, it is interesting that Glamdring and Orcrist and Sting were all recovered from the fall. Perhaps they were all near to one another again in the court of the king, when Anguiril was not. For a sword such as this, the Maid of Gurthang, that caused such woe, it would be cool to know that a servant of Melkor actually may have gotten it and used it themselves. While certainly Sauron was not present during the fall, I think it's neat to think about someone of his stature calling the sword his own, after it was recovered from the fall of Gondolin, perhaps. For Gurthang to cause such woes to the people of Beleriand, yet Anguiril to not, I almost wonder if Anguiril did cause more harm than we think. Yet more than likely it was simply lost in the ruination of the city. Morgoth's weapon Grond, the hammer of the underworld, is quite enigmatic and mysterious. Likely, I think it was forged in Angband. Maybe a Tumno, but I don't believe he used it against the Valar in the war for sake of the elves, because it probably would have been destroyed or lost to him. Likely it was made near the beginning of the First Age or the end of the Years of the Trees, as he returned to Angband. It had such an intense and powerful metal that could rend the very earth that it hit during the Battle of Fingolfin and Morgoth. He likely held onto the weapon, but never used it again after the duel, except for at the very end of the War of Wrath when he was captured. His legs were cut from beneath him and his crown was made into a collar for his neck. For as powerful as he was, Morgoth was not much of a warrior himself, particularly after he was wounded by Fingolfin and never went forth in voluntary combat again. Likely it remained unused by the seat of his throne. Of course, there are other weapons, and we discussed many of the more powerful ones with rather obscure backgrounds, but what about things such as Harrogrim or other types of weapons? I must imagine something such as Harrogrim was buried with Theoden, and other such weapons would be buried with their masters, most likely. But really that brings us to the end of our story here. Which of these theories do you believe most? What is some headcanon and other theories you have regarding these weapons and their origins and ends? Let me know in the comments below. And so, my friends, we come to the end of our tale. From the origins and ends of the most legendary weapons, we must remember that stories are always grander and more detailed in scope than we even know. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles from our friends Mythologie Candles, or order some Warrior United Cutlery, Lord of the Rings swords, statues, and other replicas from Castle Kon, who does international shipping, and use the code WEST at checkout. You can get some really awesome, cool Lord of the Rings merchandise from them, and also please check out our merch. Join our memberships and Patreon for access to Discord and our monthly podcast, an episode of which is coming soon. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons and YouTube members, Ed Patterson, ComicNut64, Brian Hunley, Peter Shepard, John Hume, Reese Jenkins, Arthur Merlin, Theodore, and Zumi, as well as Todesmorgen and Joby Weasel, our newest patrons from a few weeks ago. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel and continuing to help out the Men of the West. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the free peoples today. And I'll see you all again next week with a video explaining how Tolkien almost had Frodo fight the Witch King in Mount Doom. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.